Hi, it's me once again. I'm sorry for the delay again because I've just been so busy, and I was gonna do the blog on for the Walking Dead season 6 episode 14 twice as far, but eventually I got called into work last night. It was a madhouse over there. So, and when I got back, I was really beat. So, here we go. This is the Walking Dead Season 6 blog for episode 14 titled Twice as Far. It all started off like one of these on the first day, like you see people coming into the pantry, and you see Morgan doing his martial arts thing, and you see Eugene taking over at the gates. And you see Carol holding a rosary and smoking a cigarette outside on the porch. But eventually, this one scene, we found out what Morgan was making, and that is a jail. For anybody who gets out of line. And Rick says, "So that's what you've been doing?" And he says, "Yeah. Yes, we gotta be safe here." And so Rick and Morgan had this talk. And then the next day comes forward. Same old thing. Carol was still smoking a cigarette, but Tobin came up and kissed and gave her a kiss and went off to work. I'm like, but I turned my head on that one. Don't worry. There's good news coming at the end. And then you see Rosita got out of bed. Eventually, she had sexual relations with with an Alexandrian. So eventually, as soon as she got dressed and left the door, Rosita found out the person out of the bed under the sheets was Spencer. I guess she needed some comforting after Abraham dumped her ass. I'll never forgive Abe for that. And then eventually Daryl was sitting by his bike, and he was looking at the figurine that Dwight gave him in Always Accountable. So eventually Carol walked up and saw Daryl, and he says, "You got your bike back?" And then he asks Carol for a cigarette. And so he gives him a cigarette, and then they sat down, they haven't talked in a while, and they say, you were wrong, like you should have killed him. And he said, "I was only trying to help." And eventually, and then Carol went, and Carol got up and left. Daryl went, "Those people who took you and Maggie, what did they do to you?" And Carol went, "They didn't do anything." But eventually they did. They held him hostage and threatened them. So, but I guess Carol, she wasn't ready to talk to Daryl about it. And so Carol walked up, and then all of a sudden it came to a blur again. Then it was the same thing over and over again. This time, like, Father Gabriel was walking across the bridge, and eventually there was a lot going on, and then eventually Carol was there smoking the cigarette, holding the rosary as usual. So we won't get into that anymore. So eventually we go to the scene where, like, Abraham and Eugene were going out on a run in out of Alexandria, and eventually Spencer invited Rosita to dinner. "Why don't you try I'll make my beef jerky stroganoff. It's better than a porterhouse." And eventually then Rosita went, "What's going on with us?" And said, Spencer's trying to make it up to Rosita, and she says, "Okay." And he goes, "Okay, what? We'll have dinner." And then Denise comes on, and he says, "I wasn't listening." And eventually Denise and Rosita says, "I want to go on the run with you to get some supplies, get some more medicine." That's when the beginning of Denise was up on the bridge, on the railing, looking out of the walkers. And eventually they both went to Daryl, and then Daryl went, "You'll die out there." And she says, "I'm ready. I have to be there. I have to do this. I'm doing this. I know a place where I could get the medication. Just let me go with you guys." But Daryl went, "Then Rosita and I will go alone." And then Rosita went, "I'm not babysitting her alone." And then Daryl went, "Forget it. I'm going with you too." So eventually they all got into this beat up truck, and then Daryl was trying to drive, but he couldn't get this stick gear to go. And then Denise says, my brother learned how to drive. And he says, I can teach you that. And then Daryl went, And so eventually they stopped the truck on this, near the railroad tracks, and eventually they told Denise to stay in the car. And then eventually, and then Daryl and Rosita went hunting to look for supplies and all that. And then all of a sudden, Rosita came back. She had these little miniature bottles of liquor, like booze and all that. And then she offered one to Denise, and she said no. And then, okay, they decided to abandon the truck, and then they say, we should take the tracks. And he says, and Daryl goes, I ain't taking no tracks. And he goes, and Rosita says to him, it's twice as far what we're doing. We're taking the tracks. And then he goes, you go ahead. I'll take another route. We'll meet up. I ain't taking no tracks. So eventually Rosita, Daryl, and Denise all met up at the end, and like they were talking. And he says, who taught you how to, Denise talked to Rosita, when did you learn how to survive? And she goes, I learned from him. And she's talking about Abraham. So eventually they all met up again, and then they went to this place that Denise found that when where there's a lot of medication. And then eventually Denise went in with Daryl and Rosita, and eventually they found a pharmacy there, and eventually Denise started looking around, and eventually she thought she was going to throw up, and eventually they looked at her and she said, sorry. But eventually, as soon as Daryl and Rosita were over getting the medication, Denise went into this room, and there was a baby's playpen in there, and it looked really disgusting. And eventually Denise was pretty horrified, and then she turned around, looked, and in a sink tub full of water, there was this child's shoe that just was showing. And then Denise started to panic and all that. And eventually she's backed away and she ran, and eventually she knocked something over and it broke. And Daryl and Rosita went out, and then Denise went, I'm sorry about that. Let's just get out of here. And eventually Denise grabbed something and then ran out the door. And she sat there and started crying. And eventually she was holding this keychain that says Dennis on it. So we will know about Dennis in a few moments. So eventually they all got the medication, and then Daryl went to Denise. That was a good thing you found. Thank you for finding this place for us. You did a good thing. Okay, so now Daryl, Rosita, and Denise were walking up the tracks, and eventually to go back to Alexandria, since they got all the medication. And then all of a sudden she sees these cars. Denise sees these cars, and she says, wait, there's supplies. I'm going to go over and find him. And then Daryl went, no. And Rosita went, no, are you stupid or something? She says, well, I got to do this. And then eventually Denise ignored Daryl and Rosita's orders. She went over to one of the cars, and one of them, and she saw a cooler in the car. And she says, I found a cooler. They say, forget it, we're going. So eventually Denise decided to try her luck. And so she opens up the car door. There's this walker, and she's trying to attack her, and eventually, and she was fighting it and fighting it and fighting it off, and then eventually she stabbed the walker in the brain, and Daryl heard, and they heard the walker noises, and eventually Daryl and Rosita ran to where Denise was, and eventually she got the cooler out, and eventually she opened up the cooler, and there was a 6-pack, but there was 5 beers and an Orange Crush. And then she took the Orange Crush out and says, hot damn. And then eventually she got up, and eventually she's trying to find her glasses because she doesn't know where they are. So eventually she puked on her glasses, and then she looked at Daryl and Rosita and said, "I just puked on my glasses." And then Daryl went, "Are you crazy? You could have been killed, you know." So eventually we're going to stall from Daryl, Rosita, and Denise's part. Then we're going to go to Abraham and Eugene. Eventually, Abraham and Eugene, they went into this armory place to get some more ammo. Looks like it. And then Eugene says, I'm at stage 2. I'm ready for anything. And then eventually... they got along at first, and then eventually Abraham doubted Eugene, saying he's not ready, he's not at that stage yet. But eventually, here comes a walker comes, and eventually he was like all metal. He was wearing like metal, and there was no way Eugene was gonna get him. And then he said to Abraham, "Leave it to me." Hits him once. Abe goes, "Strike 1." Eugene hits him again, and he goes, "Strike 2." And then as soon as he about to do a final head wound, Abraham went and put the walker out of his misery. And then they got into this argument, and then Abraham told him it's better you best to pick up a turbite's clean end. Eventually, then they got into this argument, he says, and then Eugene tells Abraham, "Your services are no longer needed." And eventually he just went. Abraham, like they had this falling out because Abraham wanted, and Abraham told Eugene, "You're not at stage 2 yet. You're still at stage 1. And then Abraham went, so as soon as Eugene started to protest, Abraham went, "I give up." And he says, "Your services are no longer needed." And then Abraham went, "Find your own way back." And eventually Eugene and Abraham went their separate ways. So now we're going to get to the climax part. Eventually, Denise, Rosita, and Daryl were having an argument, saying Rosita telling Denise she was stupid that she did that. And then eventually, "I knew I was ready. I had to come. I wish I hadn't gone to Tara and I told her that I loved her." And she told Daryl, "The reason why I asked you to come with me because you are brave, and I told you you told me we had the same brother. It turns out Dennis was her twin brother." And she told him she was like Merle all the time. And eventually, that's one thing Daryl and Denise had in common. They had the same brother. And he says, "I've asked you to be brave because you're brave and you're not afraid of it, and I don't want you to be, and I trusted you to protect me." And then she said to Rosita, "The reason why you're out here because it's the first time you're alone for a while, for a long time, and I know I'm not doing this bullshit, and just because you're afraid, you can't be afraid anymore, and it makes me sick that you would come out here and do something, and if you don't get up," and then all of a sudden you see an arrow rammed right in Denise's eye. He says, "If you don't stand up and fight." And eventually Daryl and Rosita were shocked, and Denise then fell to the ground, and eventually that was, in the comic books, that was Abraham's death in front of Eugene. But eventually the series went to Denise, and I was just like, I was shocked. And eventually they had to build up a storyline. So eventually, look who came out. A lot of saviors. So Daryl and Rosita pulled their guns up, and look who's back. Dwight with Daryl's crossbow. Now you see Dwight, you haven't seen him since Always Accountable. He had he burnt the side of his face thanks to Negan's punishment and all that. And eventually, and says, "Hand over your weapons." And then eventually they did, and Daryl looked at Dwight and says, I should have killed you. And eventually, but Dwight had a big surprise. He had Eugene hostage. And eventually you see Eugene kneeling down, and he was scared. And then all the saviors were having this send-off, and eventually having this standoff between Daryl and Rosita when Dwight was holding Eugene captive. But eventually you see down by the barrels over there, you see Abraham, like he was hiding behind the barrels. And eventually, which one, before I kill him, Dwight, like Rosita says, why are you doing this? And Dwight goes, I didn't get your name. I wasn't talking to you. I said, Rosita. Her name was Rosita. Okay, Rosita, if I have to kill one of you, I'll have to kill Eugene first. And then Eugene went, wait a minute. If you want to kill somebody first, like Eugene saw Abraham, knew that Abraham was back in the barrels, back in the round barrels. And then he goes, if you want to kill somebody, if you want to first kill somebody, you kill that. The first kill you make is that guy right behind the barrels. And so eventually Dwight turned around and he said, I didn't see any barrel. I don't see any barrel. I don't see any man. And eventually the big thing came up. Eugene bites Dwight in the wiener. And eventually Dwight was screaming like a bitch, and I was just like laughing. And then Daryl and Rosita were like shooting all the saviors. They were fighting. Abraham comes out, and eventually he started fighting, and everybody started fighting. And Eugene was still busy biting Dwight's pecker. And so eventually, and then after he finished biting his pecker off, eventually Eugene somehow got wounded. And then Dwight told everyone, the remainder of the saviors, go back. And then he goes back with the saviors, and there was Daryl's crossbow right there in front of the tracks. And Daryl saw it, and then he was so happy he got his crossbow back. I was so happy. And then eventually Abraham, Rosita, and Daryl saw an injured Eugene. Like Rosita was holding Eugene's wound, pressing on Eugene's wound. And then eventually they decided, they all helped carry Eugene back to the truck. And then eventually Daryl saw Denise's body, and they say, we have to take you. They had to take Denise too. So eventually they all made it back to Alexandria, and Eugene was getting treated for his for his wound, and Daryl was looking out the window feeling guilty that he didn't save Denise. And eventually, like, they became pretty good friends. And eventually, and then Eugene went, and then Abraham went, I'm sorry. He apologized to Eugene and explained everything. He says, but I know you can bite a dick off. And I was laughing. And then he told Eugene, welcome to stage 2. And then eventually everything, the same thing that happened in the beginning, was starting over and over again. Eventually Daryl and Carol were in another scene. They were burying Denise and body, and then eventually they were both quiet, and eventually Daryl grabbed a small bottle of liquor, and started drinking, and then Carol told him, you were right. And as soon as they were burying Denise, Carol wrote this note saying that she gives Tobin, and she says, I can't be here. I know I never meant to hurt you, but I just can't be here anymore. You have food. Your place is safe. You have food, medicine, weapons, all that. I was planning. Rick sent me away, but I didn't intend to go back. Since I saved them from Terminus, I was gonna leave right away. I was gonna go right away, but eventually things happened. I didn't think she wasn't over Rick banishing her from the prison, which I hate. I never forgave Rick in season 4. That was still, it was undecided. It was very undecided. It was still up in the air, and that situation never got solved yet. So eventually, and then she says, so that's why I'm leaving. Please don't come after me. This is all for the best. I love you all. And then eventually in the ending, you see Morgan doing his Tai Chi and all that with his kendo stick. And then he turns around and he sees an empty swing with an ashtray full of cigarettes on the swing. And eventually Morgan looks at it, and then he realizes that Carol is gone, and that was the end of it. So the episode was pretty intense, but it was a little bit sad too in the ending. So eventually we're just about near the home stretch. We have 2 more episodes I need to talk to you about. The next episode I want to talk to you in my blog is the episode, season 6, episode 15, East. So eventually I will put a blog up for that before we get to the big finale, and we can have a discussion about it called Was Last Day on Earth. So that is it for me for tonight. So if you haven't seen this episode yet, spoiler alert, don't watch this until you watch the episode first. And if you want to leave comments on my blog, feel free to do so. If not, you're wonderful for listening. So remember the rules. No bashing, no disrespect, no rude comments. So anyways, this is me signing off. Have a good night, and see you again soon.